All right, welcome back, everyone. The time is now 5 o'clock. Today is Wednesday. As always, we have these live episodes every Wednesday at 5 p.m. Pacific Central Time. This is part of Self Principle, which stands for Sleep, Exercise, Love, and Food, which is my nonprofit organization. It's completely separate from my day to day work. And the goal really is how can we go ahead and help you to understand the latest research in simple, plain English? No complicated stuff, nothing where you have to worry about is there anything to gain by doing this. So make it a place where you guys can come and learn from this stuff. So today we have two topics that I want to make sure I cover for you guys. The first one is really one of my favorite topics, which is coffee. As you know, I love my coffee. Nobody pays me for coffee, but I do. And so I wanted to talk about the latest study that's out on coffee and caffeine and what's the takeaway that you want to know about it. And then with that, we're going to go into our second topic, which is making a lot more buzz. And that is what happens when you get to the point of wanting to go off of weight loss drugs, things like Ozempic, Wegovy, Saxenda, Zepbound, Manjaro. What's that future hold? What do you need to know? What are some practical steps you want to be able to take when it comes to getting off weight loss drugs? So with that, let's go ahead and dive in. As always, if you got any questions, anything you want to ask, feel free to ask now, or you can always ask it after the live part is over. So with coffee, what we understand is there's been so much data when you look at things like kidney stones, I've talked about in the past, that coffee can actually lower the risk of kidney stones. The caveat to that is you have to drink plenty of fluids. If you're dehydrated, then unfortunately coffee will increase your risk of kidney stones. Coffee, when it comes to brain health, we have lots of studies on this channel that you can find where we talk about all of the beneficial effects of coffee when it comes to brain health. Things like dementia, things like lowering the risk of future Alzheimer's. So all of that is there. But just like all things in life, if a little bit is good, too much may not be better. It may actually be worse. So we've talked about things like coffee, how it affects sleep. And so sleep becomes more and more important as time goes on. And that's why you want to understand that as you hear these things, don't think that just because a little bit is good, that a lot is going to be great. Usually that is not the case. All right. So in this particular study, what they were looking were folks with cardiometabolic disease. What the heck are all these big words that we always like to use? Well, cardiometabolic disease is nothing more than diabetes, cholesterol that's elevated, excess weight, even things like heart disease and stroke and heart failure are included in that thing. But the reason we keep talking about this term called cardiometabolic risk is because it turns out that people who have just one single cardiometabolic disease, they actually have a twofold higher risk of having death from any cause. One more time, this is so important that I want to make sure you guys hear it clearly. If you have any of these cardiometabolic diseases, diabetes, elevated cholesterol, excess weight, heart disease, heart failure, stroke, the risk of dying goes up twofold compared to those who don't. And this is why we make such a big deal about how you stay healthy. So in this particular study, this is coming from the UK Biobank data. They have about 172,000 individuals, and these were all individuals who in the beginning were free of any of these quote unquote cardiometabolic diseases. And they were, of course, assessing for how much caffeine they were drinking, and they were following them over time. So compared to people who were not consuming caffeine or were consuming less than 100 milligrams of caffeine per day, those who were getting about 3 cups of coffee. Now remember, this or a classic example, and I'm not paid by Starbucks, but I do go to Starbucks. My wife does too, so I'll use Starbucks. Starbucks tall coffee is really 2 cups of coffee. So a tall coffee is 2 cups of coffee. So remember, when studies talk about coffee, don't mistake it for like a tall Starbucks. That's 2 cups already. So in this particular study, they were comparing people who were essentially getting 1 cup or less than 100 milligrams of caffeine per day, to 3 cups of coffee per day, or caffeine around 200 to 300 milligrams per day. And keep in mind, a tall Starbucks has in between 200 to 300 milligrams of caffeine per day. And listen, if you're sensitive to caffeine, this study should not apply to you. It doesn't mean you have to drink it. In fact, some of the data that I've presented in the past in terms of cardiometabolic diseases showed that tea, coffee, and decaffeinated coffee all had the same benefits. So, what we're talking about today not just applies to coffee, but also applies to tea. So, if you love tea, go to town with it because this data applies. So, here's what they found that if you were getting 3 cups of coffee per day, you had about a 48.1% risk. So, a 48% lower risk of developing any cardiometabolic disease. In other words, your risk of developing diabetes, hyperlipidemia or excess cholesterol, obesity, heart failure, stroke was down by almost 50%. And if you were somebody getting on the caffeine numbers, so 200 to 300 milligrams of caffeine per day, you had a 40% risk. And the reason this matters so much is because if you start to think about these things, you'll start to realize oftentimes what can improve our health is actually very simple stuff. You don't have to do fancy supplement pills and all sorts of stuff. I know there's guys out there that are advocating 20, 30 pills a day, but it turns out that you get the most bang for your buck with some of the most basic things. And then the rest of it is kind of like icing on the cake. It helps, but it helps a little bit. So think about your sleep. Think about your exercise. Think about your stress reduction, mindfulness. I've gotten a new app that I've started doing every day with my daughter every morning. It's a stretching app, and I'm not endorsing it. It's one of those ones that I really like, and it's been working for me. So no endorsement whatsoever, but it's a great stretching app. I looked around at all the other ones and I thought it was great. It's expensive. I think it's way too expensive for what it is. It's pliability, but for me, it does the job and I like it. I was a big Peloton guy for the longest time, but Peloton stretching videos weren't as good. So I switched over to this one and my daughter and I like it so far. In the future, we may try others and so forth. So no endorsement whatsoever around it. But now you know about coffee, tremendous health benefits there. Now, let's go into our second topic. And our second topic is all about the issue on these weight loss drugs. So you can see I have lots of videos on the channel around weight loss drugs. What are their side effects? What do you need to know before starting? But today, we're going to focus a little bit about stopping because of the fact that this is a topic not a lot of people are talking about and you really want to understand. So when it comes to things like weight, what's interesting is when you look at the CDC website, they have these data that come out every couple of years. And the data just came out for August 2021 to August 2023. In fact, it just came out like a couple of weeks ago. And so what they were looking at was the obesity rates in the United States. So overall, the obesity rates haven't really gone up. But here's the thing. In women, unfortunately, the rates of obesity have gone up. And this becomes very important compared to looking at 10 years ago in 2013 to 2014. So it's important to understand that overall rates might not have gone up. So in other words, in men, but in women, they have definitely gone up. That's one. The other part of this is that when you start to look at severe obesity, so remember, severe obesity, we're talking about BMIs 40 and above, and what you start to find is that the rates increase from 8% in 2013, 2014 to now they're about 10% already. So this matters because the rate of obesity is rising. But here's the thing. It's rising while we have all of these new weight loss drugs. We have Ozempic, we have Wegovy, and I get tirzepatide or Zepbound is on the newer side, but still, with the advent of all of these weight loss drugs, we are still seeing the rates of obesity rise. So the question comes, what gives? Well, we're going to talk about that. Now, the other part of this that's important is when I started doing this work on this channel and I created the nonprofit Self Principle, Sleep, Exercise, Love, Food, I did it because I knew that people who are in the most need are the ones who have least access to healthcare, to health information, that somebody's not out there trying to sell something. So what's interesting about obesity is when you start to look at people with a high school education, around 45% of those fall into the obese criteria versus those with a bachelor's degree or college education or higher, it's about 32%. So, one, nobody is spared from the obesity epidemic. Number two is if you are or don't have the opportunity in life to get higher education, your risk of having obesity is higher. Now, part of that is socioeconomic status. A lot of people who come from very poor backgrounds, like I did, and have to work all sorts of crazy jobs. Look, my story is I ate Taco Bell like crazy. And all the fast food restaurants, I was probably their most frequent flyer, because when you got 50 cents or you got $1 in your pocket, this is what you end up doing. So nobody taught me that what I was doing was so bad for me. And now I kind of kick myself, why didn't I start sooner? But hey, you always tell yourself the first best time was whatever 10, 20 years ago. The second best time is today. So don't forget that. Now, when it comes to weight loss drugs, what the data shows and what you want to understand is what happens if you stop, especially the injections, things like semaglutide or semaglutide, also known as Ozempic or Wegovy. So let's start with the first study. The first study is the Step 1 trial. And so the Step 1 trial, they basically did an extension of this. Fancy words, but just understand what the study is, and I'll tell you the most important things. So they started with randomizing around 1,900 adults. All of them had a body mass index greater than 30. So remember, that's the criteria for obesity. Or they had a BMI greater than 27 with at least one comorbidity. All the people in Step 1 trial had no diabetes. This is important. And they underwent 68 weeks where they got once a week semaglutide at 2.4 milligrams. So 2.4 milligrams is the dose. So what they saw in that study was at 68 weeks, the people who got semaglutide, which is in this case Wegovy, also known as Ozempic at 2 milligrams, they lost about 14.9% of their body weight after 68 weeks. Those that were in the placebo arm lost only 2.44%. So these guys lost almost 15%. The placebo arm lost about 2.4%. But here's the key part. They took a subset, 327 participants, and they had them continue to a 1-year extension phase. So those who stopped the Wegovy or semaglutide, they ended up regaining, out of the 14.9% they lost, they ended up regaining 11.6% of that. So in other words, they regained most of their weight back within a year of stopping Wegovy. And those who were in the placebo arm, they ended up regaining about 1.9% out of the 2.4. So the reason this study is so important is because of the fact that as people stopped the drug, they went off the drug, and they didn't talk about how they went, whether they went cold turkey or not. They ended up putting back most of the weight. And so you want to understand that these folks gained the weight back. Now, the argument always is, well, what else were they doing? So all the people in the Step 1 trial, they were also being told that they needed to do lifestyle. So in other words, they were being asked to do things like reduce the calories by about 500 calories per day, and they were asked to exercise. But what's interesting is that when they stopped the drug, all those beautiful improvements in blood pressure, both systolic and diastolic, in inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein, in hemoglobin A1C at the end of that year, all of those things went back to almost where they were before they took the drug. But that's just the step 1 trial. Maybe there's a flaw in that trial. Well, let's look at another trial, step 4 trial. So step 4 was once again also looking at folks that were overweight or obese, overweight being 27 to 29.9 BMI, or obese meaning BMI third year above. And these folks also were ones that didn't have diabetes. Now, if you're wondering why they looked at without diabetes, it's because when you look at with diabetes, the results are never as good. Insulin resistance makes a big part in terms of people doing well or not. So in this particular one, they had 803 to be exact, but 800 people who had a weight loss of about 10.6% after 20 weeks, so about 5 months or so on semaglutide, and then they basically put them on placebo or a maintenance dose. And so once again, the lifestyle piece was there. They asked them to cut their calories by 500, asked them to exercise, get about 150 minutes per week. The folks that stayed on the drug for another 48 weeks, they continued to lose weight. So remember, they had already lost 10%, but they lost an additional 7.9% on average. But those who were put on placebo ended up getting 6.9% of the weight they lost, they put it back on. Why does it matter? Because what you're talking about in the second study, so step 1 and step 4, is when you stop these drugs, the weights come back. Well, let me give you one more trial, and then we'll get into talking about what you want to understand on all of these drugs. So Surmount 4 is another study that was published in 2023. This one is looking at a dual agonist, meaning 2 drugs in one, the drug called tirzepatide, which is a GLP-1 and a GIP agonist. So they put these guys on the maximum tolerated dose, which was around 10 or 15 milligrams for 36 weeks. Now remember, tirzepatide is a lot stronger than semaglutide. So in this case, people lost about 21% of their body weight. And then they followed these people up for another year, and half of them switched over to placebo, and the other half would continue. So the ones that got switched over to placebo, they put on 14% of the weight that they had lost. They lost about 20%, put back on 14%. So essentially, they were left with around 5.9% or so of the weight. The ones in the placebo arm were the ones who essentially gained the weight back, and the ones who continued the treatment, they lost on top of the 20.9 or 21%, they lost another 5.5%. So bottom line was, when they looked at the end of the 88-week Surmount 4 trial, the average weight loss for tirzepatide was 25.3% versus the ones who got switched over to placebo for a year, their weight loss on average was around 10%. So if you're hearing all this stuff and you're wondering, what is all this saying? Bottom line, just make it easy for me to understand. Here's the take-home message. The take-home message is weight loss drugs, the way they work is they are blocking your appetite signal in the brain. They can also delay food passing your stomach, but as they block that signal, your body does not change the physiology to say, well, you know what, I'm all fixed now, my hunger's not there. In fact, it actually makes those cravings stronger if you stop the drug. Now, in our clinical practice, in my clinical practice, what I end up seeing is patients, if they don't follow the intense lifestyle that we put them on, they can learn to overcome the effects of Ozempic, Wegovy, Saxenda, tirzepatide very easily, simply by having quote-unquote cheat meals. Every time you give yourself that high sugar food, that instant gratification, the first few times you're like, I feel a little nauseous because I ate something bad, and you want to throw it up. But over time, it gets easier and easier to do it. So not only is it that if you stop the drug, you put the weight back on, while you're on the drugs, you can put the weight back on. So there are a few pointers that you always want to remember. First is you don't want to abruptly stop the drug, because if you abruptly stop the drug and you're on the main dose, if you stop it right away, you're going to put that weight back on really, really quickly. The ultimate question everybody asks is, well, if we don't stop it right away, how do we titrate off? Is there any recommendations? So far, nobody has any data around how to be able to recommend. So the way that we end up doing it is we try to go slowly and sometimes even at the same pace as we were titrating up. So, in other words, every 4 weeks, we're dropping the dose down. In patients where we're looking to stop for a variety of reasons and they need ongoing weight loss meds, what we'll do is as we slow down the dosage of the injections, we will add some of the older oral drugs where we have a lot more safety data. So, we're going down on one drug. As we go down on the injection, we go up on the older oral medications where we have a lot more data. But the most important thing to remember for people is a lot of folks, when they go into the doctor's office looking for weight loss drugs, you have to make sure that you're in a place where you're ready and you want to find a doctor who will work with you, somebody who understands that, look, weight loss is hard. In fact, data shows that losing weight is actually harder than quitting smoking. It's harder than quitting alcohol, and it's harder than quitting drugs. This is how crazy weight loss is. And yet, when people are trying to quit smoking, we're like, we get it. It's going to take sometimes 8, 9 tries before you quit. But for weight loss, somehow we assume it must be easy. And when people don't succeed, we assume that is because people are lazy. None of those statements are true. In fact, they couldn't be further from the truth. Weight loss is hard. So, number one, find a provider who is your partner and not somebody who's blaming you or is angry or is making it so that everything is your fault. You're going to have good days, you're going to have bad days. But what you got to understand is if you don't have the lifestyle component, none of this is going to work. So, in other words, we've talked about the idea. Unfortunately, no matter how you look at it, you do need to cut your calories. What's one of the best ways to cut your calories without even thinking about it? A whole food, plant-based diet. You know, when I go have lunch and I'm having my salad with avocado and all this stuff, and I look at the total amount of calories, it's so low compared to what I used to eat before, which was in the thousands, and I didn't even know it. So now what I eat is very little. So switching more to plants, you don't have to go 100%. Doesn't mean you're a bad person or a good person. You know, if you have other reasons, you love the environment, you love animals, fine, go for it. But if you don't, that's okay. I'll meet you wherever you're at. But what I want you to understand is reducing your calories is important. Drinking your calories is never a good idea. So if you're drinking juices, look, eat the fruit. You like juice, I get it. No such thing as good juice. Eat the fruit. People love their smoothies. The reason I tell people not to drink smoothies is, once again, nature had millions of years to perfect food. Just the right amount of fiber, right amount of nutrients, right amount of water. And our digestive systems are built to be able to break that down. We go ahead and blend the food, and the challenge we run into is now we've made it so that all that sugar in the food can get absorbed very quickly. So that's why drinking your calories is never a good idea. People are like, I still love my sugar. I can't get my sugar. I get it. But remember, when you turn to alternative sugars, the Splendas, the Stevias, the monk fruit, and you're dealing with sweetness levels that are 200 to 600 times that of sugar, you're not helping your cravings for sugar. In fact, the data shows you're going to get insulin resistance, you're going to damage your your gut microbiome, you're going to cause yourself to have more hunger. So in rat studies, what the data shows is if you give them alternative sweeteners, they will end up eating more of their chow because of the fact that it stimulates your appetite. So that 0-calorie stuff that you think is no calories, but you get to have your sweetness, there is no free lunch. Just keep that in mind. So as you're thinking about this whole thing with weight loss drugs, please, if you're going to go on it, you got to understand this is a lifelong commitment. And if you're going to go off of it, don't go cold turkey. Slowly go off of them and have a plan. What are you going to do about cravings? With my patients, I tell them, look, make your eating as planned and boring as possible. I know it sounds crazy, but the more you have to make decisions, the more likely you are to fail. If you got to ask yourself right now, what am I going to eat for lunch? You're already in trouble. Because if you've already planned it, it's much easier to do it. But when you're tired, when you're stressed, if you're having a hard day at work, lunch becomes a place of happiness. And it's, I'm just so tired today. Let me have this, one cheesecake or whatever it is. It's much harder. But the more you've planned, the easier it is. In fact, like for lunch, when I'm working, I literally go to the same place. I order the same thing every day. I've been doing it for more than 10 years. And what's funny is they don't even ask my name anymore. They just see me and they hand me the bag. It's like I'm some, shady character walks in and it's an undercover deal, but it's none of that. It's just that I do the same thing. My wife will tell you, she's like, if I ever wanted to hire a hitman for you, it'd be the easiest thing because I know you'll be at this place at the same time. I'm such a creature of habit, but that's not a bad thing. So I hope this was helpful for you guys today. Let's take all the questions that you guys have. I see a bunch of them in the chat. Let's see. Kenneth said, I love my coffee as well. It's my favorite drink. And as far as is concerned, there's some good to it, but just don't overdo it. Remember, sleep is so critical. And if you are some of those slow caffeine metabolizers, then you may be somebody it takes 8, 9, 10 hours to get the caffeine out of your system. So if you have any trouble sleeping, don't drink after 12 o'clock. Number 2 is, let's see, Din asked, hi doc, I'm with IgA, take coffee with oat milk or almond milk. Is it recommended? Well, one is not necessarily related to the other, Din. In other words, it's not like drinking coffee is going to make your IgA better or worse, but because coffee will lower the risk of gaining weight, meaning preventing metabolic syndrome, that may actually be helpful. But more so than coffee, it's going to take all the other stuff we talk about, right? Eating better, working out, doing all those things. And IgA is a very slowly progressive kidney disease, for those of you guys who don't know. So as a result of it, there's a lot of hope in. Always remember that. Let's see. Jang said, good morning, doctor, from Australia. Welcome from Australia. That's awesome. My personal experience on Ozempic was that I used it for 3 months, lost weight during 3 months, lost around 6 kilograms, basically couldn't eat. Yeah, Jang. So, my question back to you would be it looks like you answered my question. You put the weight back on after stopping Ozempic. That's exactly right. Kenneth said, I have honey in my coffee and tea, and that's fine because the amount of sugar that you're putting in there is not that much. It's where you get the lattes and all sorts of fancy things at Starbucks. That's where the trouble starts. And Kenneth said, is there a difference between dark roast or another roast? Yes, there is. So it's interesting. Dark roast actually has less caffeine than regular roast. So I always like dark roast. I love the French roast. I just love the taste of it. But dark roast has a little bit less caffeine than regular roast. And let's see, Din said, which blend is the best morning coffee, dark roast, whichever one you like. At the end of the day, I will say that going to Starbucks, getting their coffee or coffee bean or whatever your coffee place of choice is, they'll have always more. I like my Keurig. Once again, I'm not paid for Keurig or anything like that, but I love Keurig. And that's what I use. I go to Costco when it's on sale. I buy my favorite ones, and then I just stock up. Let's see. Hayden said, I'm telling you the problem in the United States, we just eat more food than we're supposed to. Hayden, you're absolutely right. And part of the issue is because we make it so easy to have all the bad food. And then we blame the person for eating it. But literally everywhere you go, signs for all the bad food are in bright neon colors. They're at eye level in every grocery store. When you get to the cash register, it's almost like it's a minefield you got to walk through to get to the cash register because those last few steps, everything there is designed to make you eat bad food. And the worst combination is salt, sugar, and fat together. Remember, salt, sugar, and fat, when you combine all three, this is why French fries are literally the worst food out there. I know it's blasphemy, but I still got to tell you. Let's see. Beth said, okay, this is a little bit long. So Beth said, thank you for your help, doctor. Is it safe to take 500 milligrams to 1,000 milligrams of Terminalia Balearica for uric acid control indefinitely? I have CKD and was trying this naturally. The other option is allopurinol. We have been using allopurinol for decades. I've been using it throughout all my career for elevated uric acid. For long term, it's great. If you have an acute gout attack, we don't recommend it. In terms of using natural stuff, could it help? Potentially. The problem is the purity. When you have CKD, we always worry about heavy metals going and getting stuck in your kidneys, and that's why we don't want you to do it. But remember, uric acid comes not just from red meat, it also comes from diets that are rich in sugar. So the more whole foods you do, the better off you'll be. Once again, it's not just a plant-based diet, because there's a healthy plant-based diet and there's a unhealthy plant-based diet. And then Din said, does coffee help in weight reduction? A little bit, right? It can help in terms of controlling your appetite. In fact, some of the weight loss medications like phentermine is just a really strong stimulant. It's like a really strong version of coffee. So can it help? Yeah, absolutely, it can help. Same thing with folks doing pre-workouts and stuff like that. Rhonda said, are you available as a doctor specializing in obesity? If so, do you require referral? So Rhonda, remember, this is my work that I do as a nonprofit. It's just to make sure you guys get educated. I am an obesity medicine specialist. I'm also boarded in kidney disease or nephrology. Those are my 2 board certifications. I practice out of Southern California for an organization, but unfortunately, I cannot see patients outside of there. And just checking Instagram to see if there were any comments that I missed or questions. All right. So with that, I just want to thank you guys so much once again for joining me every week. The greatest compliment you can ever give me is just to share these if you find it helpful. But I just want to tell you guys how grateful I am on this opportunity. Remember, I have two daughters, and when I look at them, I just want them to know that I tried to make a little bit of contribution in this world. And the last thing I always tell you guys is you can grow up to be anything in this world. Why not grow up to be kind? Kindness is such a quality that's missing these days. It's missing in our day-to-day interactions. It's missing in the world. But being kind is the greatest gift you can give anyone else. And it's the secret sauce to living longer, because when you're kind to somebody, you lower your inflammation in your body. That's not my opinion. That's science.